He thought money could buy anything, even respect. So, when a humble flower seller approached his table, he mocked her in front of everyone, daring her to sell her roses in Arabic for $100,000. But what happened next silenced the room and changed him forever. Before we continue, allow me to wish you peace and health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story tonight? The chandeliers of the Hamilton Grand Ballroom shimmered like liquid gold, casting ripples of light over crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Outside, the streets of Savannah were wrapped in the hush of an early autumn night. But inside the hall, laughter spilled like champagne effervescent, careless, a language spoken only by those who had never known hunger. Graham Whitaker stood at the center of it all, raising a glass of Merlot as his name echoed from the microphone. "To hard work," he declared, his voice rich and smooth. "And to those of us who never waited for luck to knock on our doors." The guests applauded, the kind of applause that sounded more like self-congratulation than admiration. Graham smiled, pleased with himself. At 48, he had become the symbol of success in Savannah, the man who had turned an auto repair shop into a multi-million-dollar chain, who now wore tailored suits and measured respect and net worth. Near the long buffet, a man with olive skin and silver hair watched in silence. Omar Rahmani, an investor from Jordan, nodded politely as another businessman offered him wine. He barely touched the glass. His eyes, calm and searching, were drawn not to the laughter but to the people who didn't belong to it, the waiters moving quietly between tables, the janitor sweeping near the door. The orchestra shifted into a soft jazz number. Graham lifted his chin, scanning the crowd like a king surveying his court. "Savannah's finest," he said under his breath, "all in one room." He was about to call for dessert when the ballroom doors opened with a small creak, almost lost in the music. A young woman stepped inside. She wore a plain cream blouse and a faded skirt that brushed against worn sneakers. In her arms, a basket of red roses trembled slightly as she looked around, uncertain yet determined. For a moment, no one noticed her. Then a few whispers began to ripple through the tables. Amusement, curiosity, irritation. "Who let her in?" someone murmured. Lila Navarro clutched the basket closer to her chest. Her hands were steady now, though her heart beat like a small bird caught in a storm. "Excuse me," she said softly, her accent gentle, almost musical. "Would anyone like a rose?" Her voice barely carried above the clinking of glasses. But Omar heard it. He turned his head just as a waiter reached out to stop her. "Let her pass," Omar said quietly, his tone calm but firm. The waiter hesitated, then stepped aside. All eyes followed the girl as she crossed the glossy floor. The scent of the roses, raw and sweet, filled the air. An unwelcome fragrance among perfumes that cost more than her month's rent. Graham watched her approach with mild curiosity that soon turned to amusement. "Roses," he repeated, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "How original." His voice cut through the chatter, drawing more attention. Several guests laughed, sensing entertainment. Lila swallowed, her eyes lowering for a moment before she met his gaze again. "They're for charity, sir. For women who have no homes. 50 pesos each, is that right?" he said, remembering something from a vacation in Mexico years ago. "How much joy does that buy these days?" A nervous chuckle spread across the room. Graham enjoyed it, the laughter, the subtle reinforcement of his status. Omar shifted in his seat, his expression tightening. "They're $5, Lila said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Enough to make someone smile." $5? Graham echoed, pretending to think. For that price, they should at least talk. He looked around. "Don't you think so?" The laughter grew louder. Someone tapped a spoon against a glass. Another guest pulled out a phone to record. The sound of clinking crystal turned the moment into a cruel theater. For a heartbeat, Lila said nothing. She only held the basket tighter, her knuckles pale, the roses trembling slightly with her breath. The light from the chandelier caught the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, but her eyes brown, deep, unwavering, didn't lower this time. Omar leaned forward, sensing the shift. "Graham," he said softly, "that's enough." Graham waved him off. "Come now, Omar. Don't be such a saint. Let's make it interesting." He took a slow sip of wine, savoring the power of the moment. "Tell you what," he said, voice smooth as silk. If you can sell me those roses in Arabic, I'll pay you $100,000. The room erupted in laughter. Someone gasped. Even the pianist stopped playing for a moment. The laughter filled every corner of the ballroom, bouncing off the mirrors and chandeliers. Some people pulled out their phones to record the little show, their smiles wide and empty. Graham leaned back in his chair, a hand resting lazily on his wine glass. "Come on now," he said. "Surely you know a few words. Say something exotic." The laughter rolled again, but Omar's face didn't move. He watched the girl closely. There was something in the way. She stood her shoulders, small but squared, her breath shallow but steady. Lila lowered her eyes for a moment, as if measuring the weight of the silence that followed. The noise of silverware faded. The music trailed off. Even the waiters stopped mid-step. She looked down at the roses, then lifted her head slowly. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clear and calm across the room. "I may not speak your language, sir," she said softly, "but I understand dignity." It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the laughter like a blade through silk. Someone coughed. A glass clinked and fell quiet again. Omar's lips twitched, just slightly, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. Graham blinked, his smirk faltering. He hadn't expected that. The girl's words hung in the air, graceful yet heavy, and the laughter died the way a candle goes out with a faint hiss of embarrassment. Lila's hands trembled around the basket, but her eyes were steady. She turned toward the nearest table, offered a rose to an older woman who took it silently, leaving a $10 bill on the cloth. Then she faced Graham again. "I hope your dinner is lovely," she said simply. And with that, she turned to leave. No one stopped her this time. The soft click of her shoes on marble echoed louder than the jazz that tried to return. She walked past Omar, who rose slightly from his chair in quiet respect. As she passed, he murmured something half to himself, half to the ghost of a memory. "She reminds me of someone." The doors of the Hamilton Grand swung shut behind her, leaving the fragrance of roses in the air. It mingled with the scent of expensive perfume and wine, but somehow sweeter, purer. The guests sat frozen, their laughter still caught in their throats. Graham stared at the doorway, his fingers tightening around his glass. The wine inside no longer looked so rich. It just looked red, like something that might stain. Omar finally spoke, his tone even, eyes still on the door. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not the words that speak. It's the heart that chooses when to stay silent." No one answered. The jazz picked up again, softer this time, almost mournful. Graham let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The chandelier light shimmered across the stem of his glass, breaking into small, fractured colors. He raised the glass slowly to his lips, but the wine no longer tasted the same. Outside, under the street lamps of Savannah, Lila stepped into the cool night air. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and brushed her cheek. She looked down at the few roses left in her basket, their petals glowing faintly under the amber light. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, slow and steady, the sound of time moving forward, whether anyone was ready or not. The echoes of that night lingered long after the ballroom lights went out. By morning, the city of Savannah had already forgotten the laughter, but not everyone had. Inside the Hamilton Grand, a single rose lay forgotten on the marble floor, its petals bruised where a shoe had stepped too close. The janitor swept around it carefully, almost as if it deserved respect. Graham Whitaker didn't sleep much. His penthouse overlooked the Savannah River, a view he usually found comforting, the slow boats, the golden water. But that morning, even the sunrise looked heavy. He poured himself coffee and turned on the news, expecting to find himself on another business headline. Instead, his phone buzzed. "Viral video from the Hamilton Grand," the caption read. He clicked, and there she was, Lila Navarro, standing small and steady in a room full of wealth, saying the words that had pierced him like a quiet blade. "I may not speak your language, sir, but I understand dignity." The comments rolled in faster than he could read. "That girl has more grace than the whole room. Money doesn't buy class." He turned the phone face down. The clink of the cup on the counter echoed louder than it should have. That evening, across town, Lila arranged a fresh bundle of roses at Magnolia and Steam, a small cafe tucked between two oak trees hung with Spanish moss. The cafe always smelled of cinnamon, and hope, a place for people who didn't have much but still believed in mornings. "Rough night?" asked Marlene, the owner, wiping her hands on her apron. Lila smiled faintly. "Just a long one." The bell above the door jingled, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the room again. Through the window, the city glowed in the last light of dusk. People walked home with grocery bags. Couples argued softly over parking meters, and a boy with a bicycle stopped to buy a cookie with quarters. Ordinary life. Simple, kind, steady. She loved this hour most, when the world slowed down and didn't demand explanations. Omar Ramani stepped inside just as the cafe clock chimed 6. He didn't wear a suit this time, only a gray sweater and soft eyes that carried yesterday's memory. "Miss Navarro," he greeted gently. "May I sit?" She hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Of course." He sat across from her, resting his hands over a paper napkin. "You spoke with great courage last night," he said. "Most people would have left the room." Lila shook her head. "It wasn't courage. Just a line my teacher once said." Omar tilted his head. "Your teacher?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Dr. Samira Ramani. She used to tell us that the hardest words to speak are the ones that don't sound angry." Omar's breath caught. The name struck him like an echo from another life. "Samira?" he repeated almost to himself. "She taught me Arabic," Lila continued. "She said language is more than words. It's a way to carry someone's soul." Omar's eyes softened. "She was my aunt." Lila looked up, surprised. "Your aunt?" He nodded slowly, a smile of disbelief forming. "She passed years ago, but she would have been proud of you." Lila's eyes shimmered. "She was the kindest woman I ever knew. She used to say, Al-Karama, Fawqa Kul Shay, dignity above all things." Omar finished the sentence for her, his voice trembling slightly. They both fell silent, united by the memory of a woman who had taught them the same lesson in two different lives. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Through the glass, they looked like floating candles on a river of night. Graham arrived just then, pausing outside the cafe window. He saw them through the glass, the girl he had humiliated and the man he had dismissed. He hesitated, unsure what had drawn him there. Guilt, maybe. Or something deeper, the need to look at the moment that had cracked his pride. He pushed the door open. The bell chimed again, soft and ordinary, but the sound turned every head. Lila's eyes met his. The cafe felt quiet. The air inside Magnolia and Steam felt different now, thicker somehow, like the weight of what wasn't being said hung between the tables. Graham hesitated near the doorway, hat in hand, trying to remember how to be small in a place where money didn't mean much. Marlene glanced at him, then at Lila, then quietly returned to polishing the counter. She knew the rhythm of things unsaid. "Mr. Whitaker," Omar greeted, his tone calm but measured. "We meet again." Graham nodded stiffly. "Mr. Ramani." His eyes shifted toward Lila, who had lowered her gaze to the coffee cup in front of her. "Miss Navarro," he added. I wanted to speak with you." The cafe seemed to hold its breath. Lila didn't respond right away. She traced the rim of her cup with her fingertip, the faint scent of roses still clinging to her hands. Finally, she said, "There's nothing to explain, sir. Last night was just another night for you, I imagine." Her tone wasn't bitter, but it wasn't soft either. Graham took a seat at the table across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. "No," he said quietly, "it wasn't." For the first time, he noticed the small framed photograph on the cafe wall. A woman smiling among children, her gray hair wrapped in a light scarf. Dr. Samira Ramani. He recognized her face. Years ago, she'd fed him when he was a hungry boy selling scrap metal behind her old language school. He had almost forgotten that kindness. Almost. "She taught me too," he said suddenly, pointing to the picture. "Years ago, before I became who I am now." Omar and Lila exchanged a glance, the unspoken connection settling between them like a quiet truth finding its place. "She said something once," Graham continued, "that words can hurt or heal. I didn't remember that until last night." Lila met his eyes then, and for a long second, neither looked away. There was shame in his expression. Yes, but also sincerity, the kind of humility that only comes when pride runs out of places to hide. Omar leaned back, letting the silence do what words could not. Graham reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and placed a check on the table. "This is for your cause," he said. "For the women you help. No conditions. Lila looked down at it, then slid it back toward him. "You can't buy respect, Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly. He swallowed, nodded, and tucked the check away. "I know," he replied, voice roughened by something that wasn't anger this time. "That's not why I came." Then, softly, almost unsure, Lila said something in Arabic. Al-Kalimat Tati min al-Kalb. Words come from the heart. Omar smiled faintly. "You said that beautifully." Graham blinked, the foreign sounds washing over him like a memory he couldn't quite place. "What does it mean?" "It means," Lila answered, "that the language of respect doesn't need translation." The cafe fell silent again. Outside, the last of the daylight faded into the river. The lights of Savannah flickered to life street lamps glowing, porch bulbs turning on one by one like quiet lanterns of forgiveness. Graham stood slowly, his movements unsure but earnest. "Thank you," he said simply. Lila nodded. "You're welcome, M." He turned to leave, and as he stepped out into the evening, Omar's voice followed him like a benediction. Sometimes, redemption begins not with words, but with listening. Graham paused at the door, looked back once more, and offered a faint nod not to the room, not to anyone in particular, but to the truth itself. When the door closed behind him, Lila let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The cafe's bell jingled once, then went quiet. Outside, the night smelled of roses again. The sun rose quietly over Savannah, laying soft gold over the rooftops and the slow-moving river. The Hamilton Grand looked different in daylight, less like a palace, more like a place that had hosted too much pride the night before. The roses that had been trampled on the ballroom floor were gone, but their scent still clung faintly to the curtains. Graham Whitaker sat by the window of his penthouse, still in his shirt from the night before. The untouched breakfast tray sat beside him, eggs cold, coffee untouched. On the glass table, his phone blinked with messages. Business partners, reporters, a publicist who wanted to manage the narrative. He ignored them all. He turned the phone face down and stared at the river instead. For years, he had thought of success as a clean, straight road, a path paved with deals, awards, and charity galas that looked good in photographs. But now that road looked crooked, like something built over people he'd stepped on. He rubbed his temple, the memory of Leela's words pressing against his thoughts. "I may not speak your language, sir, but I understand dignity." He could still hear it, calm, unshaken, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be remembered. When he finally stepped outside, the city felt different too. The morning air carried the scent of pecan pie and roasted coffee from the small cafes along River Street. Church bells in the distance marked the start of Sunday service. Families walked hand in hand toward the park, their laughter light and free. He felt strangely out of place among them. At the corner of Whitaker Street, he saw a newspaper stand. His name was on the front page. "Millionaires' Mockery Sparks, Online Outrage." The photo showed him mid-laugh, the cruel gleam of amusement frozen forever under the headline. He bought the paper, folded it quietly, and slipped it into the nearest trash bin. He didn't know where his feet were taking him until he found himself standing outside a small cafe he'd never noticed before, Magnolia and Steam. Through the window, he could see warm light, chalkboard menus, and flowers in jars. And behind the counter, she was there. Lila. She was wearing a denim apron, her hair pulled back loosely, arranging a vase of fresh roses near the window. Her face looked calm, the kind of calm that came from surviving storms. For a moment, he considered walking away. It would have been easy. Pretend the night before had never happened, let the world forget in a week. But something inside him, something older than pride, told him to stay. He pushed open the door. The small bell above it chimed, and the scent of coffee wrapped around him. Lila looked up, her eyes widening just slightly, but she said nothing. He removed his hat, holding it in both hands like a man at confession. "Miss Navarro," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitaker," she replied, her tone polite, cool, distant. "I didn't come to bother you," he said. "I just needed to talk." She nodded once, motioning to a small table near the window. "All right." And he sat down, the wood creaking beneath him. A waitress poured him coffee, and he thanked her softly, something he rarely did before. "I saw the paper," he said after a pause. "Guess the internet doesn't forget easily." "It usually remembers what it should," Lila answered. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it had edges clean, honest ones. "I deserve it," he admitted. Every word. He looked down at his hands, at the gold ring that used to mean something when he still had a wife to share it with. The truth is, I don't even know why I said those things. Maybe because it was easier to laugh than to see myself in someone else. Lila said nothing. She simply stirred her coffee, the spoon tapping softly against the cup like a quiet metronome to his confession. A little girl, no older than 9, came skipping into the cafe just then, her backpack bouncing. "Morning, Miss Lila," she chirped. "Good morning, Sophie," Lila replied, her expression softening. The girl noticed Graham and tilted her head curiously. "Are you the man from the video?" Graham blinked. "I suppose he am." The child's bluntness made him smile for the first time that day. "Well," Sophie said, pulling something from her backpack, "I found this outside last night." She handed him a small photo, its edges bent, the colors faded. It showed an older woman surrounded by children, smiling warmly. Dr. Samira Hamani. Graham froze. He recognized her face instantly, not from last night's conversation, but from his own childhood. Graham's hand trembled slightly as he held the photograph. The corners were worn soft by time, the image blurred with age, but her face, that warm, kind face, was unmistakable. "She used to teach me," he murmured, "at the community center on Bay Street. I was just a boy then, selling metal scraps. She gave me food once, said every word could build or break a bridge." Lila's eyes widened. "You knew Dr. Samira?" He nodded slowly, still staring at the photo as if afraid it might fade away.
"I didn't know her full name back then. Everyone just called her Miss Samira."
Lila looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "She saved my life too." The words lingered in the air, soft but unshakable. Omar entered the cafe just then, the doorbell chiming softly as if to mark the moment. When he saw the photo in Graham's hands, his steps slowed. "I thought I'd find you both here," he said quietly. Sophie smiled. "Hi, Mr. Omar." He returned her smile, then looked at Graham and Lila. "So, you've both found her again?" Graham nodded, his voice rough. "It's strange. I spent all these years chasing what she taught me to avoid: pride, power, the illusion that success makes you better than others." Omar pulled out a chair and sat down beside them. "Samira used to say that success without humility is like a house without windows, grand, but dark inside." Lila's eyes glistened. "She told me something similar when I was a child, that the strongest people are the ones who stay gentle in an unkind world." Graham pressed his thumb along the edge of the photo, the image trembling slightly in his grasp. "And I mocked that gentleness," he said. "I turned it into something to laugh at." "No," Omar corrected softly. "You forgot it. That's different. Forgetting can be forgiven. Mockery cannot, unless you remember again." The cafe fell quiet. Outside, the bells from St. Francis Church began to ring low, steady, the sound rolling over the rooftops like an old hymn. Graham looked up at Lila. "She taught you Arabic, didn't she?" Lila nodded. "She said one day I'd need to use it not to show off, but to remind someone that words matter." Her voice broke slightly, but she smiled through it. "I guess last night was that day." Omar smiled faintly, pride and sorrow mingling in his expression. "She would have been proud. You spoke not just in Arabic, but in grace." Graham let out a breath that felt like it had been held for decades. "I don't know how to make things right," he admitted. "Not with money, not with an apology that sounds like a press statement." "Then don't make it right," Omar said gently. "Live it right." Sophie tugged on Graham's sleeve. "You can start by helping us paint the fence out back," she said matter-of-factly. Everyone laughed softly, the sound lightening the air. Lila looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. "There's coffee in the kitchen. Real work happens there, not in headlines." He rose, hesitated, then followed her into the small back room. The air smelled of roses and soap. Lila picked up a small vase with a crack along the side and began to fill it with water. "Why don't you just buy a new one?" he asked quietly. "Because," she said, placing a rose inside, "some things are more beautiful when they've been repaired." He watched her for a moment, the light catching in her hair, and something inside him shifted, not guilt, not pity, but recognition. The kind of recognition that tells you your life has just changed, even if you don't yet know how. Outside, Omar watched through the window, a thoughtful smile touching his face. "She taught them both well," he murmured. The wind rustled the cafe sign, carrying with it the faint scent of roses. Across the street, the river caught the sunlight and threw it back in soft flashes, as if the water itself were nodding in agreement. The next few days passed, with the soft rhythm of autumn settling into Savannah. The heat of summer had lifted, leaving behind a breeze that carried the scent of pine and the slow rustle of falling leaves. Down on River Street, tourists snapped photos beside the iron benches, unaware that in one small cafe, something far quieter and far more important was unfolding. Every morning, Graham returned to Magnolia and Steam. At first, he sat in the corner, silent, sipping black coffee. He didn't know what to say, so he simply showed up. It was strange for him, a man who had built an empire with words and deals to find peace in silence. Lila didn't ask why he came. She just nodded when he arrived and handed him a broom, or a tray, or sometimes a box of roses to unpack. There was a kind of forgiveness in her quietness, not spoken, but lived. One morning, Omar stopped by, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the two of them work. "You seem more at ease," he said to Graham. "Maybe," Graham replied, sweeping the floor with awkward precision. "Or maybe I just stopped pretending I was fine." Omar smiled gently. "That's how peace starts, with the truth." He glanced at the wall, where the old photo of Dr. Samira hung. "Do you remember her lessons, Graham?" "Bits and pieces," Graham said. "Mostly her voice. She used to make us repeat sayings in Arabic. I never understood half of them." Omar chuckled. "She did that to me, too. I once asked her why she never explained the meaning right away. And what did she say? That sometimes you must live a word before you can translate it." "Oh." They both looked toward Lila, who was helping Sophie tie a ribbon around a jar of roses. Her laughter, soft and unguarded, filled the room like sunlight through lace curtains. "She's living it," Graham said quietly. "Whatever those words were." Omar nodded. "Al-Rama wal-Karama. Compassion and dignity. The language my aunt believed could rebuild the world." The bell above the cafe door jingled, and a woman stepped in, one of the city's reporters. She wore a sharp red jacket and an expression that didn't belong among teacups and roses. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, pulling out her recorder, "you've been seen spending time here every day this week. Are you planning a public apology or a charity campaign?" Lila froze mid-step. The cafe fell silent again. Graham wiped his hands on a towel, his jaw tightening. "No campaign," he said evenly. "No press." The woman arched a brow. "Then why are you here?" He paused for a moment, then looked toward the photograph on the wall. "Because someone once taught me that kindness doesn't count unless you practice it where no one's watching." The reporter hesitated, lowering her recorder slightly. There was no headline in that sentence, only truth. She gave a stiff nod and left without another word. When the door closed, Graham exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Old habits die hard," he muttered. Lila approached, handing him a glass of water. "You handled that well." He smiled faintly. 10 years ago, I would have made it a press event." 10 years ago, you didn't know what a real apology sounded like," she said gently. He nodded, accepting the quiet rebuke with humility. As the day went on, customers came and went. Graham stayed long after the tables were cleared. Outside, the light began to fade and the first hint of evening crept through the window panes. Omar had left hours earlier, but his words remained. You must live a word before you can translate it. Graham found himself staring again at Dr. Samira's photograph. He whispered the words Omar had said earlier, letting them roll awkwardly off his tongue. Rama, Wal, Karama. The sound was clumsy, but the meaning, compassion, and dignity rested heavy in his chest. He looked toward Lila, who was closing the register, her movements quiet, efficient. For the first time in years, he didn't see her as someone beneath him. He saw her as a mirror, one reflecting everything he had forgotten about himself. That evening, Savannah lay beneath a silver sky, the kind that promised rain but delivered only memory. The cafe had closed hours ago, yet a dim light still glowed inside. Graham sat alone by the window, watching the street lamps flicker against the quiet pavement. The smell of roses still lingered faintly in the air. Omar entered softly, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "I thought you might still be here," he said, setting one down in front of him. "Couldn't sleep," Graham replied. "The city's too quiet when you have something on your mind." They sat in silence for a while. Two men separated by decades of choices, yet somehow linked by the same ghost, the memory of a woman who had once believed the world could be changed by kindness. Finally, Omar spoke. "You said you knew her, my aunt, but you never told me how." Graham stared at his reflection in the darkened window. "It was a long time ago," he began slowly. "I was maybe 12. My mother had just died, and I was living behind the rail yard. I used to collect cans, scrap metal, anything I could sell for a few coins." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't joy. "One afternoon, I was caught stealing bread. People yelled. The shop owner hit me. Then this woman, Dr. Samira, stepped between us. She didn't say much, just paid for the bread and asked if I was hungry. I told her no." He laughed softly. "She knew I was lying. She took me to her language school on Bay Street, made me sit down and eat. I remember the smell of mint tea and chalk dust." Omar's eyes softened. "That sounds like her. She asked if I knew what my name meant." Graham continued. "I told her it didn't matter. She said, 'Names matter, because they remind you that you belong somewhere.' Then she made me promise something, that if I ever became someone, I'd help another boy the way she helped me." He paused, his voice thickening. "I never did." The rain began to tap softly against the glass, like fingertips, keeping time with his regret. Omar leaned forward, his expression gentle. "Maybe you still can." Graham looked at him, then down at his hands. "Do you think she'd forgive me? For forgetting her? For becoming this?" Omar took a slow sip of coffee. "My aunt didn't believe in punishment. She believed in circles, that everything we give, good or bad, comes back until we set it right." Graham nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's why I met Lila. Maybe she's my circle." The clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, the river moved like melted glass, reflecting the city's quiet lights. Omar reached into his coat and pulled out an old envelope. "Before she died, she wrote me a letter," he said. "I never knew what she meant by the last line until now." He unfolded the paper carefully. The ink was faded, the handwriting delicate. "If one day you find a man who has everything but peace, tell him I am still teaching through the hearts of those he forgot to see." Graham swallowed hard. "She knew," he whispered. Omar smiled faintly. "She always did." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air was heavy, but not with guilt, with something more sacred. The kind of silence that feels like prayer. When Graham finally stood, his eyes glistened in the soft light. "I don't know how to repay her," he said quietly. "By giving what she gave you," Omar replied. "A chance to begin again." Graham nodded slowly, his voice breaking just enough to be human. "Maybe redemption isn't something you earn," he said. "Maybe it's something you return." The rain outside grew steadier, washing the streets clean. Inside, the two men sat in stillness, as if the night itself was listening and forgiving. And on the wall above them, the photograph of Dr. Samira seemed almost to smile, her eyes glimmering in the candlelight like a woman who had finally seen her lessons come home. "Maybe redemption is not something you earn," Graham whispered. "Maybe it's something you return." The following week, the air in Savannah turned crisp, the first breath of winter touching the river. The leaves along the old oak-lined streets had begun to bronze, and every gust of wind carried the faint scent of pine and salt from the coast. Down on River Street, the world went about its usual pace, shopkeepers setting up for the day, the clatter of boats along the pier, and a man standing on the bridge, looking out over the water, as if waiting for forgiveness to rise with the tide. It was Graham. He had been coming to that same spot each morning, the worn stone bridge that overlooked the cafe below. The bridge wasn't famous or grand, but it was quiet, the kind of place where thoughts could breathe. In his hand, he held a single rose. He didn't know why he brought it. Maybe as a habit now, or maybe because it reminded him that beauty could grow from something fragile. Behind him, footsteps approached. "You look like a man waiting for someone," Omar said, his voice carrying the calm warmth of a morning prayer. Graham smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." "She'll come," Omar said, standing beside him. "Not because she owes you anything, but because forgiveness has its own timing." They both looked out at the river, where sunlight broke into ripples like small, forgiving hands. A few minutes later, Lila appeared at the far end of the bridge, her coat fluttering slightly in the wind. She paused when she saw them, then walked closer. The silence between them was not cold. This time it felt like space that had been earned. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning?" Graham replied, the word carrying more weight than its size should allow. Omar nodded politely, then excused himself, sensing the moment wasn't his to witness. When he left, only the murmur of the river remained. "I come here every morning," Graham began, trying to figure out what to say that doesn't sound like an apology rehearsed in a mirror. Lila looked at him quietly. "Sometimes silence says enough," he nodded. "You're right, but there's something I need to say out loud, not to make peace with you, but with myself. Em says..." He paused, fingers brushing the rose in his hand. "The truth is, I was that boy she helped Samira. I didn't deserve her kindness, and I didn't know what to do with it. I grew up thinking success would erase where I came from, but all it did was erase the part of me that could feel ashamed." Lila's eyes softened. "When I saw you that night," he continued, "standing there with those roses, I saw her again. Not her face, but her courage. And it terrified me. How..." The words hung between them like the mist over the water. Lila stepped closer, her hands in her pockets. "Fear doesn't make us cruel, Mr. Whitaker, but refusing to face it does." He nodded slowly, breathing out through the ache in his chest. "Then maybe this is me facing it." She looked out at the water. "You can't undo what happened." "I know," he said, "but maybe I can plant something better in its place." He offered her the rose, a single, trembling bloom against the wind. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I'd like to learn what it looks like." She hesitated, then reached out and took it gently, her gloved fingers brushing his. For a moment, neither spoke. The river moved beneath them, slow and silver, reflecting the fragile grace of two people trying to build a bridge that wasn't made of stone. Finally, she said, "Forgiveness isn't given. It's grown. You have to water it every day." He smiled faintly. "Then I'll show up every morning, if that's what it takes." She turned to him then, really looking at him, not the man from the headlines, not the one from the gala, but a man trying to remember who he once promised to be. "I'll hold you to that," she said quietly. He nodded. "You should." The wind carried the scent of roses again, faint and clean. Beneath the bridge, the water shimmered as if echoing their words. The next day, the cafe was busier than usual. The smell of cinnamon and brewed coffee wrapped around the place like an old blanket. The small radio on the shelf played soft gospel music, and sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting golden patterns across the worn wooden floor. Lila stood behind the counter, helping a woman count the money she'd earned selling handmade candles. "Every dollar helps," she said, smiling. "Keep some for yourself this time, Marta." At the same moment, the door opened, and Graham stepped in carrying 2 boxes. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, no suit jacket, no polished pride. He looked almost ordinary. "Morning," he greeted, his voice humble but warm. "I brought something." Lila turned, surprised. "What is it?" He set the boxes down and opened one. Inside were packets of seeds, roses, jasmine, lilies, each labeled neatly. "For your garden out back," he said. "Figured we could plant them together. The cafe could use a little more color." Sophie, who had been drawing in the corner, gasped. "You're going to plant flowers?" Graham smiled. "If Miss Lila lets me." Lila crossed her arms but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. "You'll have to get your hands dirty." "I think I've been waiting a long time to do that," he said. They stepped outside into the small courtyard behind the cafe, a patch of earth that had once been forgotten, half covered in gravel and weeds. The afternoon light fell softly through the oaks, and the air smelled of soil and salt. For the next hour, they worked side by side, digging, planting, laughing quietly at crooked rows and stubborn roots. It wasn't perfect, it was real. At one point, Graham paused, brushing the dirt from his palms. "You know," he said, "I used to think giving money was the same as giving back. But this," he gestured to the small garden, "this feels different." "It's slower," Lila said, "but slower things tend to last longer." Omar arrived a little later, watching them from the gate. "You've turned this place into a memory," he said, smiling. Graham stood and wiped his hands. "Maybe a beginning." They all went back inside, and for the first time in months, Graham felt the kind of peace that didn't come from success or applause. It came from belonging, from being useful without being needed, from helping without expecting thanks. As the afternoon faded into a golden dusk, he sat near the window with a cup of coffee that Lila had poured for him. The cafe buzzed softly with chatter, the smell of fresh bread and roses filling the air. Omar leaned over. "You know, Samira always said that bridges aren't built with stone. They're built with people who decide to meet in the middle." Graham nodded, his gaze drifting to the small garden outside, where the first petals of pink had begun to open. "She was right," he said softly. "Some bridges aren't built with stone, they're built with second chances." Lila overheard and smiled faintly without turning around. "Then make sure you keep crossing it, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at her, his eyes warm. "I intend to." Outside, the river reflected the first stars of evening. The faint sound of laughter drifted through the cafe door, blending with the hum of life, returning to ordinary grace. And for the first time in years, Graham Whitaker no longer felt like a man defined by what he'd done wrong, but by what he was willing to do right. Some bridges aren't built with stone, they're built with second chances. A few weeks later, the air in Savannah carried the scent of early spring. The roses behind the cafe had begun to bloom, soft and red, their petals trembling with every southern breeze. The garden, once a patch of forgotten dirt, was now alive not just with flowers, but with laughter. Word had spread through the town about the Rose Project, as people had started calling it. Every Saturday, the cafe opened its doors to women from the neighborhood's single mothers, retirees, widows who came to make handmade bouquets, share stories, and sell their creations at the farmer's market. Lila stood behind a wooden table, showing a young mother how to tie a ribbon around a vase. "You don't have to make it perfect," she said gently. "Just make it honest." And in the corner, Graham was unpacking boxes of supplies. He had ordered ribbons, jars, labels, his movements careful, almost reverent. He looked less like a businessman now and more like a man who had finally learned how to stay still. Omar entered, carrying a stack of flyers. "You've done it, my friend," he said. "People are talking about this place. They say it smells like hope." Graham smiled, wiping his hands. "Hope's not a bad perfume to wear." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes easy when there's peace in the air. Later that afternoon, a small local reporter came by to take photos for the Sunday paper. She moved around quietly, snapping pictures of the women arranging flowers, of Lila helping a child reach for a rose stem, of Graham handing a bouquet to an elderly man who had stopped by just to watch. When she approached him for a quote, he hesitated. "I'm not sure what to say," he admitted. "Maybe start with why you did this," she suggested. He looked around the garden, the people, the color, the light filtering through the trees, and said simply, "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing to give back. This is just me keeping the promise." That line ended up on the front page of the Savannah Journal the next morning, right beneath a photograph of Graham holding a rose. The headline read, "The CEO who chose to plant instead of profit." The story spread faster than he expected. Messages poured into the cafe from people who wanted to volunteer, donate, or just say thank you. Yet amid the praise, Graham felt a quiet ache. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was the memory of a woman who had taught him what generosity sounded like, and the wish that she could see it now. That night, after everyone had gone home, he stayed behind to close up. The cafe was silent, except for the creak of the floorboards and the faint ticking of the clock. On the counter sat a single rose that Lila had left for him, its stem wrapped in a ribbon of soft blue. A note was tied to it. "Keep planting. You're making her proud." He stood there for a long time, holding the flower, the words blurring slightly through his tears. Then, as if on instinct, he walked to the old community board near the door, the one covered with notices about garage, sales, and choir events, and pinned the note right in the center. "Let's see who needs a little reminder tonight," he whispered. Outside, the wind swept through the oaks, scattering petals across the cobblestone street. Somewhere in that gentle rustle, it almost sounded like applause, the kind that comes not from a crowd, but from heaven itself. And, for the first time in his life, Graham realized something simple. Hands that once built walls could also plant gardens. Hands that once built walls could also plant gardens. A week later, the cafe was packed beyond capacity. The garden outside overflowed with flowers, and the smell of fresh bread mingled with rose petals in the warm air. Someone had brought a speaker, and soft jazz played under the laughter of children chasing each other between the tables. It wasn't just an ordinary Saturday, it was the first community rose fair, organized by Lila and the women of the project. Local artists sold paintings. Neighbors shared homemade pies. And the small courtyard buzzed with life. At the center of it all, Graham stood quietly, wearing a simple linen shirt and an expression that was equal parts gratitude and disbelief. A microphone had been set up on a makeshift stage, and Omar approached him, gently resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," he said. Graham took a deep breath. "Do I have to?" Omar chuckled. "You don't have to, but you get to." Lila gave him a small nod from across the crowd. Sophie waved, holding a paper rose she'd made herself. So he stepped forward. The chatter softened. The music faded. For a man who had once lived behind boardroom walls and corporate speeches, this silence felt different. It was honest. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying a tremor that wasn't fear, but humility. "I never thought I'd stand in a place like this again, surrounded by kindness I didn't earn." He paused, looking around at the faces, some curious, some smiling, some still cautious. "I used to believe success was measured by how high you could climb," he said. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that real height is measured by how far you can reach down." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Years ago, a woman named Dr. Samira changed my life, with nothing but a loaf of bread and a kind word. She didn't see a thief that day, she saw a hungry boy. I built my fortune and forgot her lesson. Until another woman walked into my life one night, holding a basket of roses, and reminded me what grace looks like." He turned toward Lila, who lowered her gaze, eyes shining. "This project," he continued, "isn't mine. It belongs to every hand that chose to build instead of blame. Every woman who came here, every man who showed up to help, every child who planted a seed. You've all given this town something money can't buy." He looked down at his hands. Once, these hands hurt people by neglect, by pride, by silence. But someone taught me that hands that once built walls can also plant gardens. Redemption isn't about forgetting the past. It's about using your hands to heal what they broke. A deep stillness filled the air. Even the children stopped running. Then, softly, someone began to clap. It was Lila. Omar followed. Then the crowd until the sound grew and grew, echoing through the narrow street like a heartbeat. Graham lowered his head, the sound washing over him like a wave of mercy. When the applause quieted, he smiled. "We'll keep planting," he said simply, "because kindness, once planted, doesn't stop growing." Later, as twilight painted the sky in pink and gold, Graham stood by the garden, helping a little boy water the roses. The boy spilled half the water, and Graham laughed, not the polished laugh of a businessman, but the gentle laugh of a man who finally understood what it meant to belong. Lila joined them, her hands tucked into her apron pockets. "You did well today," she said. He looked at her, eyes soft. "We did well." For a long moment, they stood in silence, listening to the laughter inside, the distant sound of a church bell, and the river humming beyond the street. Then Graham said quietly, "You know, for years, I thought forgiveness was something people gave you, but it's not." "What is it then?" Lila asked. He smiled faintly. "It's something you learn to live inside of." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "And once you're there, you never want to leave." They looked at the roses, blooming under the fading light. Some petals had fallen, scattered like blessings across the soil. And somewhere deep within him, Graham felt that maybe, just maybe, Dr. Samira could see this garden too. Redemption isn't about forgetting the past. It's about using your hands to heal what they broke. Spring melted into summer, and the cafe had become more than a shop. It was a rhythm in the town's heart. Every morning, the smell of coffee and roses floated down the cobblestone street, and every evening, laughter spilled through the open doors like light escaping a lantern. On one quiet afternoon, when the air was heavy with the hum of cicadas, Lila found an envelope waiting on the counter. It was cream-colored, sealed with red wax, and addressed in careful handwriting. To Mr. Graham Whitaker and Miss Lila Henderson. No return address. Only a faint emblem embossed on the corner, an intricate crescent intertwined with petals. Lila frowned, curious, and brought it into the back room where Graham was sorting receipts. "You expecting international mail?" she asked. He looked up, puzzled. "Not that I know of." When she handed him the envelope, his hands trembled just a little. He broke the seal gently. Inside was a folded letter, its paper thick, its ink deep blue. He unfolded it, and the words stared back like a voice from another life. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, my name is Faris Al-Mansour. I write to you from Dubai. I am the nephew of Dr. Samira Al-Mansour. I was told by my uncle Omar that your story reached our family and our hearts." Graham read aloud, his voice quiet, steady. "My aunt spoke of you often in her journals, though never by name. She wrote of a boy with eyes like winter, who once stole bread not from greed but from hunger. She said she saw goodness in him, goodness hidden under fear. Before she passed, she asked that if I ever met that boy again, I remind him that forgiveness is not a debt to repay, but a light to pass on." Lila sat down slowly, her hand covering her mouth. "We've heard of the garden you built, and how her name still blooms there. You should know that her students in Jordan have started a small program inspired by yours, teaching children to grow flowers and kindness together. They call it the Hands of Samira." Graham stopped reading for a moment. His throat tightened. She remembered," he whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. You have kept her light alive. She believed words could travel farther than oceans, and now I see she was right. May peace always find you beneath the roses, Faris Al-Mansour." When the letter ended, the room fell silent, except for the sound of the ceiling fan turning above them. Graham sat back, the paper trembling in his fingers. Lila leaned forward, her voice soft. "She was proud of you, Graham. You gave her story a new ending." He shook his head, tears shining but not falling. "No," he said quietly. "She gave me mine. M." They sat there for a long time, the letter between them like a bridge, not of stone, but of light. Later that evening, the cafe closed early. Lila hung the closed sign, and Graham brought out an old wooden box. He placed the letter inside, next to a small photo of Dr. Samira that Omar had given him. Then he lit a candle and set it beside the box. "I used to think light came from success," he said softly. "Turns out, it comes from people who refuse to let kindness die." Lila nodded. "Then maybe we should make sure it never does." Outside, the sun dipped below the river, and the candle's glow danced across the window, small but certain, like a promise made of flame and memory. Forgiveness is not a debt to repay, but a light to pass on. The following Sunday evening, the cafe hosted a small gathering. Word had spread about the letter from Dubai, and neighbors, volunteers, and friends filled the courtyard, carrying candles and paper lanterns. The air smelled of roses and coffee, and a faint breeze stirred the soft light, as if the night itself was breathing. Omar stood near the doorway, smiling quietly as he arranged the photographs of Dr. Samira, one taken in her youth in Jordan, another from her days teaching in Savannah years ago. Beside them lay the framed letter from Faris, now placed where everyone could see. When the clock struck 7, Graham stepped forward. His once stiff posture had softened over the past months. The weight in his shoulders seemed to have turned into calm. The small crowd fell silent. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," he began, voice low but steady. "But some words aren't meant to stay on paper, M." He looked down at the letter in his hands. "A few days ago, I received this from a man in Dubai, the nephew of Dr. Samira. He said something that's been echoing in my head ever since." He unfolded the page and read aloud, his voice breaking just slightly. "Forgiveness is not a debt to repay, but a light to pass on." He let the words hang in the air. They shimmered there, soft but unshakable. "When I was young," he continued, "I thought forgiveness meant erasing what I'd done wrong. But now I understand it means turning that wrong into something that can grow." He looked toward Lila and smiled. "This cafe, this garden, all of you, you've turned my mistakes into something living." A little girl from the crowd, Sophie, tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "He sounds like Grandpa when he tells stories." The audience chuckled softly, and Graham's eyes warmed. "I've spent most of my life trying to build empires," he said. "But this," he gestured around them, to the garden glowing under the lanterns, to the people gathered close. "This is the only thing that's ever felt real." He paused, letting the murmur of the river and the hum of evening fill the silence. "If you take anything from tonight, let it be this. Don't wait for the perfect time to make peace. Just start, even with small hands, even with shaky hearts. The crowd listened, still, moved not by grandeur, but by sincerity. He nodded toward Omar. Doctor, Samira used to say the smallest act of kindness can travel farther than the loudest speech. I guess she was right. Her kindness made it all the way back here. Omar smiled, eyes glistening. And it keeps traveling, my friend. Lila stepped forward with a small lantern in her hands. She handed it to Graham. On its glass side was etched a single word: light. Would you do the honor? She asked. He nodded. Together, they lifted the lantern toward the night sky. One by one, others followed, lighting their own and releasing them until dozens of soft lights floated above the river, drifting upward like slow, glowing prayers. For a moment, everyone stood in silence. No speeches, no applause, just the quiet wonder of seeing something beautiful rise from the dark. As the last lantern disappeared into the clouds, Graham whispered almost to himself, "She'd like this." Lila looked at him. "Who?" "Samira," he said. "She always said light was the only thing worth chasing." Lila smiled. "Then I'd say you finally caught it." He looked up once more, the lantern still glowing faintly above the river. And for the first time, the man who had once been haunted by guilt simply stood there at peace, bathed in golden light, surrounded by the quiet music of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a debt to repay, but a light to pass on. Autumn had come again to Savannah. The air turned crisp, and the roses behind the cafe glowed deeper in color, their fragrance drifting into the street like an old hymn. The cafe's wooden sign creaked softly in the wind, faded now from sun and salt, but still proudly reading, "The Rose Project, where hands grow hope." Inside, the place felt alive with gentle noise laughter, the scrape of chairs, the hum of conversation between people who had learned to show up for each other. At one of the corner tables, Graham sat with a cup of black coffee and a folded newspaper. His hair had more gray in it now, and fine lines had deepened around his eyes. But there was a new kind of ease in the way he carried himself. The article in front of him featured a headline he hadn't expected to see again. Local Community Project expands to 3 states. Lila came up behind him, drying her hands on a towel. "They got your picture again," she said teasingly. He smiled. "Ours, you mean?" She rolled her eyes. "Mine's not in there. Then I'll ask them to fix that." The small joke made them both laugh. It wasn't the laughter of people who forgot the past. It was the laughter of people who had survived it together. Omar entered a few minutes later, carrying his ever-present satchel. He'd been helping set up new rose projects in Alabama and South Carolina. His eyes lit up at the sight of the crowded cafe. "I swear this place grows faster than the roses," he said. "It's not the place," Graham replied. "It's the people." Omar nodded, then placed a small package on the table. "This came for you this morning." Graham opened it. Inside was a small framed photograph, the one of the lanterns floating above the river, and a handwritten note beneath it. "For every season that ends, another begins. F.A.M. Ferris," Lila murmured softly. Graham smiled, brushing a thumb along the frame. "He's right. Every season brings its own light." They fell quiet, watching the afternoon sun stretch across the counter, painting golden lines over the rose jars. A group of school children entered then, carrying small bouquets they'd made in class. The teacher, a woman in her 60s, explained that they were here to donate them to the local nursing home. Lila guided them to the back garden where they could pick more stems. Graham stood by the window, watching them run among the flowers, small hands reaching for petals, small voices full of excitement. For a moment, the image blurred with memory. Another boy, hungry and lost, stealing bread decades ago, and a woman's hand, gentle and firm, offering kindness instead of judgment. He smiled, the memory no longer painful. "You did it, Samira," he whispered. "You kept the light going." Omar approached quietly. "You know," he said, "she always believed her work was unfinished. Maybe this is how she meant it to be continued, not completed." Graham nodded slowly. "Then I'll keep it going, as long as these hands can still hold a rose." Outside, the first leaves of fall began to drift down onto the garden path. Lila's voice called to the children, soft and warm. "Be careful with the thorns, sweetheart. The beauty's worth it, but it asks for gentleness." Graham turned toward her voice, the faint smile still lingering. "She's right," he murmured. "Always is." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note, the letter from Forrest now worn at the edges. He carried it everywhere, not out of guilt, but as a reminder that forgiveness, once found, should never be forgotten. As he tucked it back into his coat, he looked around the cafe, the clinking cups, the smell of bread, the laughter, and realized something simple. Redemption hadn't changed his life overnight. It had changed it one morning, one act, one person at a time. For every season that ends, another begins. Autumn returned to Savannah, painting the town in gold and rust. The roses behind the cafe glowed deeper in color, their scent mingling with the chill in the air. The sign above the door, weathered by time, still read proudly, "The Rose Project, where hands grow hope." Inside, laughter and the clink of cups filled the cozy space. Graham sat near the window, reading the morning paper. His hair was grayer now, but peace had softened the lines around his eyes. The headline read, "The Rose Project expands across 3 states." Lila came by with a fresh pot of coffee. "They mentioned you again," she said, smiling. He chuckled. "They should have mentioned you more." Omar arrived soon after, carrying his satchel and the smell of the river. "You've built something beautiful here," he said. "We all did," Graham replied. Omar handed him a small package. Inside was a photograph, the lanterns floating above the river, and a handwritten note. "For every season that ends, another begins. F.A.M. Ferris," Lila whispered. Graham smiled softly. "He's right. Every season brings its own light." Outside, school children ran among the roses, gathering bouquets to take to a nursing home. Their laughter drifted through the open window, mixing with the rustle of falling leaves. Watching them, Graham thought of Samira, of the bread she had once offered, the lesson she had left behind. He smiled, the memory no longer heavy. "You did it, Samira," he murmured. "The light's still alive." Omar touched his shoulder. "Then keep it shining." "I will," Graham said quietly, "as long as these hands can still hold a rose." The sun dipped low, coloring the garden in amber light. Lila's voice floated through the air. "Be careful with the thorns, kids. Beauty asks for gentleness." And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, roses, and the warmth of forgiveness, Graham finally understood. Redemption doesn't erase the past. It grows from it. For every season that ends, another begins. The last rose had long withered, yet its fragrance seemed to linger in Graham's life, a quiet reminder of the night everything changed. He was once a man who measured worth in dollars and pride, but after meeting Lila, he learned to measure it in kindness and grace. Sometimes, it takes a single moment of humility to heal years of arrogance. Their paths crossed by chance, but what grew from that encounter was something neither could buy nor plan: a newfound respect for life, for humanity, for second chances. In a world that moves too fast, their story reminds us that the softest voices often carry the strongest truths. Just as a single rose can transform a cold room, one act of dignity can restore faith in the human heart. Perhaps that's what redemption really means, not forgetting the past, but using it to water something better. Like an old family dinner on a Sunday evening, where the table may be scratched and the plates mismatched, yet the laughter feels perfect. Love has never needed perfection to be real. Because love and forgiveness build the kind of home that money can't. Everyone deserves a place to belong, a chance to begin again, and someone who believes in them. And just like a small porch light glowing in the night, a single act of kindness can guide us through the darkest roads of life, no matter how far we've fallen. There's always a way back to warmth. Now tell me, my friend, if this story touched your heart, press 1 the comments. And if it didn't, or if you have thoughts to share, press 0. Either way, your voice matters here. And if this story brought you peace tonight, share it with someone who still believes in heartwarming stories like this one.